April 2025, April 2026, 12 months, no announced physical, no scheduled date at Walter Reed, no published results. That is not a scheduling oversight. That is a pattern. And for a 79-year-old man who is currently managing an active military confrontation with Iran, presiding over a naval blockade in the world's most critical energy choke point, and making decisions that could affect every person on this planet, that pattern is a story that every American deserves to hear clearly and completely. Let me give you the basic timeline first, because the math here is not complicated. Donald Trump's last confirmed and publicly documented annual physical took place in April of 2025. Standard protocol for any sitting president, especially one of advanced age, is that the White House announces the physical date well in advance. The examination takes place at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and the results are published for the public record. This is not a partisan issue. This is a constitutional transparency issue. The American public has a fundamental right to know whether the person holding the most consequential decision-making position on Earth is physically and cognitively capable of holding that position. In October of 2025, Trump made a claim that raised immediate questions among medical observers. He announced he was receiving what he called a semi-annual physical, meaning he does physical examinations every 6 months rather than annually. He referenced advanced imaging. He then said it was an MRI. Then he said he was wrong and it was a CT scan, but only of the abdomen. The inconsistency in that description, noted at the time by multiple medical commentators, is itself a data point. Either the president does not know what medical procedure he underwent, or the information being communicated to the public was being carefully managed to obscure something. Neither possibility is reassuring. Here we are now, April 2026. Whether you count from April 2025 or from October 2025, a physical examination is due, and there is no announcement, no date on the calendar, no Walter Reed scheduling notice, nothing. Meanwhile, the behavioral record from the past 48 hours alone, documented publicly on camera in Trump's own words and posts, is raising alarm bells not just among his political opponents, but among right-wing media outlets that have been among his most reliable defenders. We are going to go through that record today, piece by piece, with full citations. We are also going to talk to the medical and constitutional framework that explains why this matters beyond politics. And we are going to explain what the absence of a physical announcement, combined with publicly observable behavioral changes, means for the decisions being made right now in the most dangerous geopolitical crisis America has faced in decades. Subscribe right now and turn on every notification. This story has implications far beyond one person's health. You need every update. Presidential health transparency in the United States has a complicated history, and understanding that history is essential to understanding why what is happening right now is unusual, even by the standards of a presidency that has repeatedly broken precedent. Every president since Ronald Reagan has undergone regular, publicly disclosed physical examinations, with results released to the American public. Reagan's physicals became particularly important in the context of public concern about his age and cognitive function during his second term. George H.W. Bush's examination results were public record. Bill Clinton's, George W. Bush's, Barack Obama's, all documented, all released. The standard was established and maintained across administrations of both parties for a simple reason. The American public and the constitutional order require confidence that the commander-in-chief is physically and mentally capable of executing the duties of the office. When Trump entered office in 2017, his first White House physician, Dr. Ronnie Jackson, held a press briefing after Trump's January 2018 physical that became controversial for its unusually effusive characterization of the president's health. Jackson described Trump as being in excellent health and suggested he could live to be 200 years old if he had better dietary habits. Multiple physicians watching that briefing publicly noted at the time that the language being used was more promotional than medical, more consistent with managing a political narrative than communicating an honest clinical assessment. That established a pattern of health communication around this president that medical observers have described consistently as carefully managed rather than transparently disclosed. I want to know what you think right now. Comment the word disclose if you believe the American public has a right to Trump's full and unedited medical records, given his age and the decisions he is currently making. Comment the word private if you believe a president's health is a personal matter that should not be subject to public scrutiny. Drop it below. I read every single comment. The April 2025 physical, the last confirmed one, produced a report that, when read carefully by medical professionals rather than political communications staff, contained details that raised specific concerns. Trump's weight was documented at a level that places him in a clinical category associated with elevated cardiovascular risk. His cholesterol management, maintained through medication, was noted. And the cognitive screening that was included, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, a basic screening tool that Trump has repeatedly boasted about passing, was described in language that multiple neurologists noted was consistent with a minimum passing threshold, rather than a strong performance. None of this is diagnosis. I want to be clear about that. No physician who has not personally examined Donald Trump can diagnose him with anything. What medical professionals can do, and what several have done publicly on the record, is observe publicly available behavior and note when that behavior is consistent with patterns that warrant clinical evaluation. And that is exactly what a growing number of medical voices across the political spectrum are now doing openly. Let me walk you through the publicly documented behavioral record from the past 48 hours, because this is not speculation and it is not partisan commentary. This is a factual account of what the President of the United States did and said on camera and in writing during a period when he was simultaneously managing an active military ceasefire with Iran and presiding over a naval blockade affecting global energy markets. Start with Tuesday. Trump called into CNBC, a major financial news network, not to discuss the Iran ceasefire, not to address the naval blockade, not to comment on oil prices affecting every American consumer. He called in to tell the hosts that he would have won the Vietnam War quickly if he had been president at the time. Trump received 5 draft deferments during the Vietnam War, including one for bone spurs. The claim that he would have won a war he took specific documented steps to avoid serving in was not challenged in the interview in any substantive way. But the decision to make that specific call to that specific network on that specific morning, when the world was watching the Strait of Hormuz, is a behavioral data point that multiple political and medical observers flagged immediately as disconnected from situational context. Then, the same day, Trump posted an AI-generated image of himself depicted as Jesus Christ. He followed that by posting attacks on Pope Francis, the spiritual leader of approximately 1.3 billion Catholics globally. Then, later that evening, he recorded and posted a video of himself reading Bible verses. In that video, which was widely circulated and analyzed, multiple observers noted audible slurring and what was described as labored delivery of sentences. The Washington Examiner, I want to emphasize this because it matters. The Washington Examiner is a right-wing conservative publication. It is not a liberal outlet. It is not an anti-Trump media organization. And the Washington Examiner published a piece this week with a headline that read, in plain terms, that Trump is losing his mind. Let me read you the substance of what they wrote because it deserves to be heard clearly. The Washington Examiner described a 79-year-old man posting what they called deranged content in the small hours of the night, insulting religious leaders, threatening civilizations with annihilation, and comparing himself to God. They wrote, and again, this is a right-wing publication, that his episodes are becoming more frequent and his good days further apart. They wrote that what he has lost is not decency or decorum, but any remaining sense of self-control, and that everyone around him can see it. When a publication that has been a reliable defender of this president publishes language like that, it is not a political attack. It is a journalistic assessment from people whose credibility depends on accuracy, not opposition. But while the CNBC call and the religious posts were generating attention, something else was also happening simultaneously in Trump's late-night social media activity that a number of analysts described as particularly concerning from a cognitive standpoint. Trump spent significant time posting content that contained factual claims with no basis in verifiable reality. He posted about CIA directors supposedly plotting coups, about Democrats changing impeachment standards through what he described as literal treason, and about conversations he claimed to have had with unnamed people who approached him saying, and this is a direct quote from his post, "Sir, Iran wants the strait to be open immediately." Note the spelling of strait as straight. Note the phrase blockadened, a word that does not exist, used in another post from the same period to describe the blockade he has imposed. Now, individual spelling errors and invented words can happen to anyone under stress. I am not citing those as standalone evidence of anything. What I am noting is the combination The misspellings, the invented words, the factually unsupported claims presented as breaking news, the late-night timing, the religious imagery, the Vietnam War call, all occurring within a 24-hour window as a behavioral pattern that, in any other workplace in America, would trigger a conversation about whether the person exhibiting it is well. And here is the detail that I think deserves specific attention, because it connects the behavioral pattern directly to the Iran crisis in a way that has concrete policy consequences. In one of his late-night posts this week, Trump wrote that he has spoken with people who approached him saying, "Iran wants the Strait open." He used the phrase, "people approached me for days ago," grammatically incoherent, and described a conversation where unnamed individuals told him, "Iran wants to save face." He presented this as inside intelligence. He presented it as his basis for understanding what Iran actually wants in these negotiations. Compare that to what American intelligence agencies, the State Department, and allied governments are publicly saying about Iran's negotiating posture, which is that the situation is highly fluid, that Iran's internal factions are pulling in different directions, and that no clear unified Iranian position has yet emerged. The gap between the president's stated understanding of the situation and the actual documented complexity of the situation is significant. And it raises a question that nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking directly enough. If the president's internal model of what Iran wants is based on conversations that may or may not reflect operational reality, what does that mean for the quality of the decisions he is making in response to it? Here is what medical professionals have said publicly and on the record about what they are observing. Because I want to be precise about the sourcing here, I am not making a medical diagnosis. I am reporting what credentialed physicians have said in public forums about publicly observable behavior. Dr. Vin Gupta, a pulmonologist and public health physician who serves as a medical analyst and has commented on presidential health matters across multiple administrations, recently offered his assessment of what is being observed in Trump's public appearances. Dr. Gupta noted specifically that Trump has a documented family history of age-related cognitive decline. Trump's father, Fred Trump, experienced age-related cognitive deterioration that has been well documented and that multiple members of the Trump family have spoken about publicly over the years. Mary Trump, the president's niece and a clinical psychologist, has referenced this family history in published work. Dr. Gupta noted that he does not have access to Trump's medical records, no outside physician does, but he stated that he is observing what he described as symmetry between some of the signs currently visible in Trump's public behavior and the patterns that characterized Fred Trump's cognitive decline in its earlier stages. He described this as concerning precisely because the president is the person with nuclear codes, with command authority over active military operations, and with sole decision-making power over a ceasefire that could determine whether the United States enters a full-scale war with Iran. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who has been one of the more direct voices in public life on this specific issue, stated in a recent interview that he does not know anyone who acts the way Trump acts, in terms of promising something and then doing the opposite, saying something and then immediately contradicting it, who does not have some kind of issue thinking things through. Pritzker has been explicit that in his assessment, Trump is exhibiting signs of dementia. That is his stated opinion as a public official on the record. George Galloway, the British political commentator, offered an assessment recently that described what he sees as a combination of rapid cognitive decline alongside what he called retained low cunning, a pattern he described as more toxic than straightforward impairment because it means the person can still be strategically manipulative while being operationally unreliable in ways that are difficult for the people around them to manage. Now, here is what the White House has said about all of this. Nothing specific. No scheduled physical date, no response to questions about when the next Walter Reed examination will occur, no medical update of any kind. The communications strategy appears to be to neither confirm nor deny a physical is overdue, simply not addressing the question and hoping the daily news cycle moves past it. We are not moving past it, and here is why that matters beyond the political dimension. The 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides a mechanism for the Vice President and Cabinet to remove a president who is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. That mechanism has never been invoked in American history. But it exists precisely because the founders understood that a time might come when the person holding the office was not capable of holding it, and the country needed a constitutional pathway that did not require waiting for an election. The fact that we are now discussing this amendment, not as a partisan talking point, but as a constitutional framework, in the context of a president who is managing an active military confrontation and has not disclosed a medical examination in a year, tells you something about where the public conversation has arrived. Let me explain why presidential cognitive health is not just a personal matter, and why the absence of a disclosed physical examination has specific, concrete consequences for the decisions being made right now. Because I think this argument needs to be made clearly and without partisan framing. The President of the United States, under the current constitutional and legal framework, has sole authority over a set of decisions that affect every person on Earth. He can authorize nuclear weapons use. He can commit military forces to combat operations. He can sign or veto legislation that affects the financial lives of 330 million Americans. He can conclude or terminate international agreements. In the context of the current Iran crisis specifically, he is the person who decides whether the ceasefire holds, whether the naval blockade is maintained or modified, whether military strikes are authorized if Iran violates ceasefire terms, and whether a negotiated nuclear framework is accepted or rejected. These are decisions where cognitive clarity is not optional. They are decisions where the difference between a well-reasoned judgment and an impulsive, contextually disconnected reaction could mean the difference between a negotiated peace and a regional war with global economic consequences. When a president is posting about winning the Vietnam War on the same morning that ceasefire negotiations are at a critical juncture, the question of whether that president's cognitive state is affecting his decision-making process is not a gossip question. It is a national security question. Here is the specific analytical problem that the missing physical creates. Without a current, independently verified medical assessment, the American public has no baseline against which to evaluate what it is observing. The behavioral changes that medical observers are noting, the slurring, the factually disconnected posts, the word-finding issues visible in public speech, the late-night social media activity that reads as disconnected from operational reality, cannot be properly contextualized without knowing what the current clinical picture looks like. They could be symptoms of significant cognitive impairment. They could be symptoms of extreme sleep deprivation under the stress of managing a military crisis. They could be symptoms of medication side effects. They could be symptoms of a combination of all three. Without a physical examination with disclosed results, nobody outside the president's immediate medical team knows. And here is the problem with relying on the president's immediate medical team for that information. The White House physician serves at the pleasure of the president. The history of White House medical communications around this specific president, going back to the 2018 press briefing with Dr. Jackson, demonstrates clearly that the medical communication function has been used to manage political narrative rather than to provide transparent health disclosure. There is no independent mechanism currently in place to verify that what the White House physician says about the president's health accurately reflects the clinical picture. This is what historians will identify as the transparency gap. The structural absence of any independent verification mechanism for presidential health, creating a situation where the American public is dependent entirely on a politically managed information channel for information about the cognitive and physical fitness of the most powerful decision maker on Earth. The constitutional scholars who study the 25th Amendment framework have noted consistently that the amendment is most likely to be relevant not in cases of obvious dramatic incapacitation, a president in a coma, for example, but in cases of gradual decline that is visible to those working closely with the president, but difficult to document formally in ways that trigger the constitutional mechanism. Gradual cognitive decline is, by its nature, difficult to establish a precise moment for. It is a process, not an event. And a process is much harder to respond to constitutionally than an event is. There is one more analytical point that I want to make clearly, because it addresses the argument that will inevitably come back in response to this analysis. That argument is, Trump has always been erratic, always been unconventional, always communicated in ways that strike observers as disconnected from normal political discourse. That is a fair historical observation. Trump's communication style has never conformed to conventional political norms. But the people raising concerns about cognitive decline right now, including the Washington Examiner, including Republican-aligned medical professionals, including members of his own political orbit who are speaking anonymously to journalists, are not making a general complaint about Trump's unconventional style. They are making a specific observation about change, about frequency, about the difference between what they observed 2 years ago and what they are observing now. Cognitive decline is diagnosed through change over time, not through a single behavioral snapshot. And the people closest to this president are describing a rate of change that they find alarming. That is not a partisan observation. That is a clinical one. Let me connect this directly to the decisions being made right now, because the health question and the Iran question are not separate stories. They are the same story viewed from different angles. The Iran ceasefire is currently the most consequential active diplomatic and military process in American foreign policy. The ceasefire extension was announced by Trump personally. The terms of what constitutes a ceasefire violation, and therefore what triggers a military response, are defined by Trump's personal interpretation of events in real time. The decision to accept or reject whatever negotiated nuclear framework Iran eventually produces will be made by Trump personally, based on his assessment of whether the terms are acceptable. Each of those decisions requires the decision maker to maintain consistent positions across time, to process complex technical information about nuclear enrichment and verification mechanisms accurately, to weigh competing pressures from military advisors, diplomatic advisors, and allied governments coherently, and to communicate those decisions clearly and consistently to the people who have to execute them. If the behavioral pattern being observed publicly, the internally contradictory posts, the factual errors in real-time statements about the crisis, the invented words, the contextually disconnected communications, is also present in the private deliberations driving these decisions, then the decisions themselves are at risk of being incoherent in ways that have real-world consequences measured in lives and economic stability. Consider one specific example. Trump posted this week that Iran wants the Strait of Hormuz open because closing it costs Iran $500 million a day, and that people have been approaching him for days saying, "Sir, Iran wants it open." Setting aside the "sir" framing that has become a reliable indicator of fabricated conversations in Trump's public communications, the factual claim about what Iran wants and why is directly contradicted by Iran's own public statements, by the IRGC's operational behavior in the Strait, and by the intelligence assessments that have been publicly discussed by senior American officials. If the president is telling himself a version of the Iran situation that does not match the operational reality his military and intelligence advisors are seeing, the gap between the president's internal narrative and the actual situation creates a decision-making environment that is genuinely dangerous. The people around Trump, his cabinet, his senior advisors, the Joint Chiefs, are watching this. The Washington Examiner's characterization that everyone around him can see it but continues to rationalize it out of ambition, cowardice, or weary acceptance is consistent with what multiple anonymous White House sources have described to journalists in recent weeks. An administration that cannot internally acknowledge what it is observing in its own president cannot effectively manage it. And an unmanaged cognitive decline in the most powerful decision-making position on earth is not a political problem. It is a security problem of the first order. The allies watching this, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, are conducting their own assessments of American decision-making reliability in real time. Every erratic public statement, every contradictory policy position, every contextually disconnected communication that comes from the White House is being fed into foreign government assessments of how much they can rely on American commitments and American leadership in the current crisis. The credibility of American deterrence is not just a function of military hardware. It is a function of whether adversaries and allies alike believe the person making decisions is making them rationally and consistently. Here is where this goes, and let me be direct about what needs to happen and what the realistic range of outcomes looks like. The missing physical examination needs to be addressed publicly and specifically, not with a press release written by the White House communications team, with a full, independently reviewed medical assessment at Walter Reed, with results disclosed to the American public in a format that allows medical professionals outside the administration to evaluate them properly. This is not an unreasonable demand. It is the standard that every president of the modern era has met. It is the standard that the American public has a right to expect from anyone holding this office, regardless of party. The behavioral record of the past 48 hours, documented on camera, in writing, and through public statements, will not disappear from the public record. The Washington Examiner piece will not be retracted. The CNBC Vietnam War call will not be unaired. The Bible verse video will not be deleted from the servers where it has already been archived and analyzed by hundreds of thousands of people. These are permanent entries in the documented record of this presidency, and they are now sitting alongside a gap in the medical transparency record that the White House has not explained. The 25th Amendment conversation, which is happening now in public forums, in congressional offices, and in private conversations among people across the political spectrum, will continue and will intensify if the behavioral pattern continues without a medical transparency response. Governor Pritzker's public statement about dementia is not going away. Dr. Gupta's observations are not going away. The Washington Examiner editorial is not going away. The question is not whether this conversation is happening. The question is whether the institutions responsible for managing it, the cabinet, the Congress, the vice president's office, are going to respond to it or continue to look away. Meanwhile, Trump is managing a war right now, today.
With whatever cognitive resources he currently has, whatever support structure surrounds him, and whatever gap may or may not exist between his internal understanding of the Iran situation and the operational reality his military commanders are managing in the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire he extended is not self-executing. It requires continuous decision-making. The naval blockade is not self-managing. It requires judgment calls every day about what constitutes a violation and how to respond. These decisions are being made. We just do not know with full confidence by whom, in what cognitive state, and with what degree of consistency between what the president understands and what is actually happening. The Walter Reed appointment that has not been announced is not a scheduling footnote. It is a window into how this administration is managing, or failing to manage, the most fundamental transparency obligation a president has to the people he serves. We will be tracking this. We will report the moment a physical is announced. And we will be here to analyze whatever results, if any, are eventually disclosed. The American public deserves to know, and we are not going to stop asking until they do. A 79-year-old president, an active military confrontation, a missing medical examination, and a behavioral record from the past 48 hours that right-wing media is now describing in language that would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. If this breakdown gave you the full picture, hit the like button right now. It puts this analysis in front of the people who need to see it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on every notification. The moment a Walter Reed appointment is announced, or the moment the behavioral pattern escalates further, you will get the complete breakdown here first. Share this with someone who needs the full context behind the headlines. This is too important to stay inside one corner of the internet. Stay locked in. This story is not going away.